Don't you dare speak to him in front of my guests." My daughter-in-law pointed her finger at me like I was a dog that had wandered in off the street. "He's just here to help with the catering." 42 people heard that. 42 people watched my son look at his shoes. I didn't cry. I didn't leave the room. I laughed quietly to myself, because the woman who just called me the hired help had no idea that her name wasn't on a single piece of paper in this house. Not one. "Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of this story, and drop a comment telling me what part of New Zealand you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this has reached. My name is Gerald Whitmore, and I'm 67 years old. I spent 35 years building a small but solid engineering consultancy in Wellington. The kind of business that never made the front page of any newspaper, but quietly, steadily, generated more wealth than most people in my street would ever guess. My late wife, Patricia, used to joke that we were the richest-looking poor people in the suburb. We drove sensible cars, lived in a modest house in Karori, bought our furniture second-hand, and put everything else into investments, property, and our son's future. When Patricia passed away from cancer 4 years ago, I lost the person who made sense of everything. We'd been married 38 years. She was 61. It wasn't enough time. It never would have been. Our son Daniel was 34 when his mother died. He'd been with his partner, Renee, for about 2 years by then. Renee was polished in a way that always made me slightly uneasy, the kind of polish that takes a lot of maintenance and other people's money. She had opinions about everything, and the confidence to deliver them, even when nobody had asked. Daniel adored her. I could see why. She was beautiful and clever and completely certain of herself in a way that my son, who had always been a little unsure of his place in the world, found irresistible. After Patricia died, Daniel suggested I sell my house in Karori and move in with them. At the time, they were renting a flat in Thorndon. Daniel said, "It would be good for all of us. Company for me, stability for them." I could tell it was Renee's idea dressed up in Daniel's voice, but I didn't say so. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told either of them, was what Patricia had left behind. We'd been careful with money our entire lives. Patricia's father had been a farmer in Hawke's Bay, old school, salt of the earth. And when he died, he left her a share of the land. When that land was eventually sold to a developer, the amount was substantial. Combined with the sale of my consultancy, which I sold 18 months after Patricia's death, when I decided I had no appetite left for the day-to-day of running a business, I found myself sitting on just under $3 million. I told no one. Not Daniel. Not my sister in Christchurch. Not a soul. Instead, I did something I thought was generous. I bought a house. A proper house. A 4-bedroom home on a quiet street in Kandala with views of the harbor and a garden big enough for grandchildren to run around in, should any ever arrive. I paid for it outright. $940,000 cash. I put it in my name only. Then I told Daniel and Renee I'd bought it as a family home, that they should move in with me, that it was an early inheritance of sorts, a way of keeping us all together, while I was still well enough to enjoy it. I never said I'd transferred ownership. I let them assume. Then I made things worse by saying nothing about the money I began sending their way every month. Daniel's architecture firm was modest, the sort of practice that gets by on small residential renovation jobs. Renee didn't work, or rather she worked in the way people describe work when they mean they sometimes attend things and call it networking. Their income was nowhere near enough for the life Renee wanted to live, so I quietly covered the shortfall, $6,000 a month, flowing through a separate account, making its way into their lives as what they believed was the firm's growing success. I wanted Daniel to feel capable. I wanted him to stand straight. I know now that I was wrong to do it the way I did. You cannot build someone's confidence on a foundation that isn't real. And you cannot protect someone from difficulty by secretly paying for them to avoid it. But I was 63 years old and grieving, and I thought I was helping. That's the truth of it. The first sign that something had shifted came about 6 months after we moved in together. Renee began suggesting, gently at first, and then less gently, that it might make more sense if I took on some of the domestic responsibilities. I was home all day, after all. It only made sense for me to be useful. I started cooking, then cleaning. Then, when Renee's friends came over, I found myself being introduced not as Daniel's father but as Gerald, who helps with the house. I told myself it was just her way of speaking. I told myself Daniel didn't realize how it sounded. I kept telling myself things that weren't true because the alternative, accepting that my son was allowing it to happen, was more painful than I could manage at the time. By the end of the first year, I had a routine. I was up at 6 to tidy the kitchen, prepare breakfast, and get a load of washing on before Renee came downstairs. I ate my meals in the kitchen rather than the dining room, because Renee had decided the dining room was for entertaining, and she didn't want it cluttered with my newspaper and coffee cup. When tradespeople came to the house, she introduced me as the property manager. Once, when a colleague of hers arrived unexpectedly, she introduced me as the housekeeper's husband, then laughed as though it were a joke. Except I was the only one who didn't laugh. Daniel knew. He saw it all and said nothing. That was the thing I could never quite make sense of. He wasn't a cruel man. He loved me. I believed that. But he had handed the running of the relationship entirely to Renee, and Renee had decided what my role was. And somewhere along the way, Daniel had accepted it because it was easier than arguing with her. The occasion that changed everything was his parents-in-law's anniversary dinner. Renee's parents, Colin and Maureen, were celebrating 40 years of marriage. The party was held at our house, because our house was the largest and most suitable. 42 guests filled the lounge and the garden. People from Renee's family and social circle who I had never met and would never see again. I had spent 2 days preparing the food. Slow roasted lamb, 3 salads, a pavlova, because this is New Zealand, and there is always a pavlova. I was carrying a platter of sliced lamb to the main table when I heard it. One of Renee's cousins, a well-meaning woman named Trish who clearly hadn't been briefed, was gesturing in my direction and saying to someone beside her, "Oh, is that Daniel's dad? He's been doing all the cooking, hasn't he? Someone should go thank him." Renee appeared beside me before Trish could take a step. "Don't you dare speak to him in front of my guests," she said, keeping her voice low but not nearly low enough. "He's just here to help with the catering. We don't need to make a scene." The platter was heavy. I remember that detail clearly, the weight of it in my hands, as the words settled over the room. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they slowed. Heads turned just slightly in that way people's heads do when they've heard something uncomfortable and don't want to appear to have heard it. Trish looked mortified. "I'm so sorry," she started to say. "It's fine." Renee cut her off. "Gerald, why don't you take that through to the kitchen and then come back for the serving dishes?" I looked at Daniel. He was standing near the garden doors with his hands in his pockets. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked away. I set the platter down on the table, not gently. "Actually," I said, and something in my voice made the nearest conversations go completely quiet. "I think I'll leave the serving to someone else tonight." Renee's expression tightened. "Gerald, don't worry," I said. "I'm not going to make a scene. I'm just going to stop carrying the food." I walked to the kitchen, put the oven mitts on the bench, and went upstairs to my room. Behind me, I could hear Renee restarting the conversation at the table, her voice bright and social and completely in control. I could hear Daniel saying nothing. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked out at the harbor. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something colder than anger. It was clarity. These people were living in my house, driving cars I had paid for, wearing clothes funded by money I quietly deposited into their lives every month. And Renee had just told 42 people that I was the hired help. I thought about Patricia. She would have had something to say, something dry and perfectly timed. I missed her with a ferocity that still surprised me sometimes. Then I picked up my phone and called my solicitor. I'd used Margaret Fong for 20 years. She'd handled my business affairs, my property transactions, and Patricia's estate. She was 60, sharp as anything, and the kind of person who doesn't waste words. "Margaret," I said, "I think I need to make some changes to some documents. I also think I need to understand what my legal position is regarding a property that someone has been occupying under a misapprehension." She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She said, "Come in on Monday and bring everything." Over the next 2 weeks, I paid attention in a way I hadn't before. I had been moving through the house like a ghost, focused on cooking and cleaning and not making trouble. Now I listened. 3 days after the anniversary dinner, I was in the laundry folding sheets when I heard Renee on the phone in the hallway. Her voice had that particular carrying quality it took on when she was performing competence for someone she wanted to impress. "The situation with Gerald is becoming a bit difficult," she was saying. I recognized the careful, managing tone. He had a little episode at Mom and Dad's dinner. Nothing serious, but it was a bit embarrassing. "I'm starting to wonder if he's really coping as well as we thought." I folded a pillowcase. "I've spoken to Daniel about it," she continued, "and we both think it might be time to look at some options. Not immediately, but it's worth being prepared. There are some very good retirement villages up the Kapiti coast." I set the pillowcase down on top of the others. She wasn't talking about retirement villages in the way people do when they mean lovely communities where older people enjoy independence and social connection. She was talking about it in the way people do when they mean somewhere out of the way, somewhere Gerald wouldn't be underfoot, somewhere the house would just be theirs. Episode. She had called my response to public humiliation an episode. Over the following week, I learned more. My daughter-in-law, it turned out, had been doing some quiet reputation management that extended well beyond her social circle. She had spoken to Daniel's sister, Pauline, who lived in Auckland with her husband and their 2 children, my grandchildren, 8-year-old Noah and 6-year-old Lily. Pauline and I had always been close. She called me Grandpa Gerald and her kids called me the same, which was the greatest honor I had going. But over the past several months, Pauline had been keeping the children away. Visits that used to happen every school holidays had stopped. The children, who used to throw themselves at me when they arrived, had become strange and formal. The one time I'd seen them in months. Lily had whispered something to her mother when she thought I wasn't looking. Pauline had quickly changed the subject. I called Pauline directly. I asked her to be honest with me. There was a long pause. She said, "Renee told me you've been getting confused lately, that you've been saying the house belongs to you, that you get agitated when corrected." She said the children were asking questions, and she thought it was better to limit their exposure until things were more settled. I sat with that for a moment. "Confused," I said. "She told you I was confused." Pauline's voice was uncertain. She said it's quite common after a loss, that sometimes people develop these beliefs, these fixed ideas. She said Daniel is very worried about you. "Is Daniel worried?" I asked. "Or is Renee worried on his behalf?" Another pause. Longer. This time, I said, "Pauline, I need you to trust me on something. I need you to bring Noah and Lily down to Wellington on the weekend after next. I'm going to explain some things. And after that, you can make whatever decision you think is right." She agreed, though I could hear the hesitation in her voice. The following Monday, I was in Margaret Fong's office. I laid out everything: the house purchase, the monthly payments, the way the financial arrangements worked, what I had overheard about the Kapiti Coast retirement villages, what Renee had told Pauline about my supposed confusion. Margaret is not a person who shows alarm easily. She showed something close to it. She said, "Gerald, you understand that if someone is actively building a case for cognitive decline in order to take control of your assets, that constitutes elder abuse under New Zealand law. It can carry criminal liability." I said I understood. She said, "And you understand that as the sole legal owner of that property, you have comprehensive rights that they cannot challenge without your cooperation." I said I understood that too. She said, "What do you want to do?" I looked out her office window at the traffic moving along the terrace. I thought about 2 days of cooking for 42 people and being introduced as the catering staff. I thought about Lily whispering something to her mother. I thought about Renee's voice on the phone. Very good retirement villages. I want them to understand the full picture, I said. Not just what they've lost. I want them to understand what they chose, when they had every opportunity to choose differently. Margaret nodded once and opened her notepad. The first step was financial. I contacted my bank and restructured the accounts, removing the automatic transfers that had been maintaining Daniel and Renee's lifestyle. I didn't do this dramatically. I simply stopped. Within a fortnight, the reality of their actual income would become impossible to ignore. I didn't have to wait a fortnight. I had to wait 9 days. It was a Tuesday evening when Daniel came to find me in the garden. I was deadheading the roses, which was something I did when I wanted to think. And I'd been thinking quite a lot lately. He sat down on the garden bench uninvited, which was fine. It was my garden. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." He sounded uncomfortable in the way he always did when Renee had asked him to do something he didn't want to do. "There's been a bit of a complication with some of the business accounts. Things are a bit tight." I kept working on the roses. "How tight?" I said. He said, "We might be short for the mortgage payment this month. I know it's a big ask, but I was wondering if you might be able to help out. Just temporarily." I said, "What mortgage payment?" He looked at me. He said, "Well, the house mortgage." I set my secateurs down on the edge of the raised bed. I said, "Daniel, I bought this house for cash. There is no mortgage." He went very still. I said, "Whoever told you there was a mortgage payment was mistaken. Or not." He said, "But the monthly payments, the ones that come out every month?" I assumed. "You assumed," I said, "because Renee managed the accounts and you didn't look closely." "I know. I've been watching for a while." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad, what's going on?" I said, "Why don't you come inside? I've asked Margaret to join us tomorrow morning, and I think this conversation is better had with her present. But I'll tell you one thing tonight, so you can sleep on it. The money you thought was coming from the business, it wasn't." I watched his face while he processed that. I said, "Good night, Daniel." I went inside and made myself a cup of tea. Margaret arrived at 9 the next morning. Renee had clearly been expecting some kind of confrontation because she was already dressed, composed, and seated at the dining room table with the look of someone who has prepared for a difficult meeting. Daniel sat beside her. He hadn't slept. I could see that. Margaret set her briefcase on the table and opened it without ceremony. She said, "I'm going to outline the current legal and financial situation as clearly as I can. Please hold your questions until I've finished." She went through it methodically. The property title, in my name alone. The purchase price and method of payment. The monthly financial transfers over the past 3 years. Approximately $216,000 in total. The current account balances, which she had printed out and placed face up on the table. The absence of any mortgage, any car finance in Daniel's name, any credit arrangements that didn't trace back to me. Renee's composure cracked before Margaret was halfway through. She said, "This is outrageous. You've been deceiving us." Margaret looked at her calmly and said, I'd recommend waiting until I've finished. I watched Renee's hands on the table. They were very still, which I had learned meant she was working hard to stay controlled. When Margaret finished, the room was quiet enough that I could hear the neighbor's lawnmower 2 houses down. Then I spoke. I said, "I want to say something before either of you respond. I did not structure things this way because I wanted to trap you. I structured them this way because I wanted to help Daniel without making him feel like a charity case. That was my mistake, and I own it. But what happened at your parents' anniversary dinner was not a misunderstanding. And what you've been telling Pauline about my cognitive state is not a misunderstanding either. And the conversations you've been having about retirement villages on the Kapiti coast are not something I misheard." Renee's eyes sharpened. She said, "You were listening to private conversations." I said, "I was in my own home. There's no such thing as a private conversation you didn't have the courtesy to take out of earshot of the man whose house you were standing in." Daniel put his face in his hands. I continued, "I want to be precise about what I know. I know that you contacted a retirement facility. I know that you spoke to Pauline and told her I was experiencing cognitive decline, which is why my grandchildren have been kept away from me. I know that you've been describing my behavior to people as episodes. I know that your plan, once you'd established a narrative of instability, was to have me placed somewhere and gain effective control of this property." Renee said. "That is not what we were doing," I said. "Then what were you doing?" She had no answer for that. Margaret said, "For the record, any attempt to pursue a declaration of incapacity in circumstances like these, where the subject is demonstrably competent and the motivation is financial, constitutes a serious matter under New Zealand's Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act. I'd encourage you both to take that seriously." Daniel said, "Dad, I didn't know about the retirement village. I swear, I didn't know the extent of it." I looked at my son. I believed him, partly. I believed he didn't know the details. I wasn't sure he had asked not to know them, which is a different thing. I said, "Daniel, there are things you didn't know because you didn't look, and there are things you did know because you watched them happen in front of you, and you said nothing. Both of those are problems." He nodded. He couldn't argue. Then I told them what would happen next. The house would remain in my name. Margaret had prepared a formal occupancy agreement, which they could sign or not. If they signed, they would pay market rent, which Margaret had assessed at $4,200 per month based on comparable properties in Kandala. They would be responsible for all utilities, vehicle expenses, and their own costs of living. My monthly transfers had stopped and would not resume. If they did not sign, I would begin the process of reclaiming occupancy, and they would need to make other arrangements. Renee said, "You can't be serious. We have nowhere to go." I said, "That's not quite accurate. You have Renee's parents, who have a large home in Whitby. You have options," she said. "After everything I've done for this household," I said, "I think you may have the accounting on that backwards." Daniel said, "What about us? Is there any version of this where we're still family?" That was the question I had been sitting with for 2 weeks. I had turned it over every morning in the garden and every evening when I couldn't sleep. I said, "Daniel, I am your father. That doesn't stop, but I spent 3 years being invisible in a house I own, cooking meals I wasn't invited to sit down for, being described to strangers as the catering staff, and watching you let it happen. I need you to understand what that cost. Not the money. The other thing." He said he understood. I said, "I hope you do. Because the version of this, where we are still family, requires you to make choices you haven't been making. It requires you to decide, clearly and out loud, what kind of son you want to be." Renee signed nothing. She called her mother that afternoon. and by the weekend, she had moved her things to Whitby. She was not gracious about it. I heard her on the phone to at least 3 people telling them that I was a controlling, vindictive old man who had manufactured a crisis to drive her out of her home. She was not entirely wrong about the first part. I had been patient in a very deliberate way, and patience with a purpose is its own kind of control. But the rest of it wasn't accurate. Daniel stayed. He sat across from me at the kitchen table that first evening and said, "I don't know how to fix this." I said, "You fix it by being honest. With me. With Pauline. With the kids." He said, "I've already called Pauline. I told her everything. She was not happy with me." "Good," I said. "She shouldn't be." He said, "She's bringing Noah and Lily down next weekend." I said, "I know." "She called me herself." He looked at his hands. He said, "I let Renee define who you were in this house. I don't have a good explanation for that. I think I was so relieved that she wanted to run everything, that I just let her run everything, including the parts I shouldn't have allowed." I said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years." He looked up. I said, "We'll work on the rest." 3 weeks later, Pauline arrived with the children on a Friday afternoon. Noah came through the front door first, stopped when he saw me in the hallway, and then ran at me with the full force of an 8-year-old who has been told a story he no longer believes. Lily took longer. She stood at the door with her mother's hand in hers and looked at me carefully. Then she said, "Are you really Grandpa Gerald? Not the worker?" I crouched down to her level. I said, "I really am Grandpa Gerald. I own this house, and I planted that garden, and I'm very glad you're here." She considered this for a moment. Then she came inside. We had lamb for dinner, because that's what I'd been planning for 2 days. We sat in the dining room, all 5 of us, and I sat at the head of the table where I should have been sitting for 3 years. After dinner, when the children were watching something in the lounge, and Pauline had taken herself out to the garden with a glass of wine, Daniel came to stand beside me at the kitchen bench. He said, "Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to do better." I said, "I believe you." 6 months on, Daniel had taken on 3 new clients and was managing his own expenses for the first time in years. He paid the occupancy contribution on time. He cooked dinner twice a week. Not because I asked him to, but because he said he wanted to learn. He and Renee had filed for separation in February. She had told anyone who would listen that I had ruined her marriage. I thought she had done that particular job herself, but I didn't say so publicly. Noah and Lily came every school holidays. Lily had appointed herself the official helper for whatever I was making in the kitchen, which meant she stood on a step stool and explained to me what she thought we should be doing differently. She was 6 and absolutely certain of her opinions. She reminded me of Patricia. I don't tell this story to make myself sound clever or to paint Daniel as entirely at fault. He made choices that hurt me, and I made choices that enabled harm through silence and secrecy. We were both wrong in our own ways. What I hope is useful is this. The money was never the point. Not really. Money is simply the form that power takes when families haven't learned to speak plainly to each other. What I actually wanted, what I had always wanted, was to be seen as a father and a grandfather and a man of some worth, not because of what I contributed financially, but because of who I was to the people in that house. When we hide our resources to protect someone else's pride, we sometimes rob them of the chance to stand on their own. When we endure poor treatment in silence, hoping things will change, we are sometimes teaching the people around us that the treatment is acceptable. And when we allow someone to define our role in our own home, we have already surrendered more than we realize. If you are older, if you have supported people who have forgotten to look up and notice what you have given, you are not alone. And if you are younger, watching this and perhaps seeing something familiar in Daniel's position, I ask you to do what Daniel eventually did. Look honestly at what is happening in front of you. Speak up before someone else is forced to. Dignity doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who knows who they are, even when no one else seems to remember. I smiled for the first time in years at that dining room table with my family around me. It wasn't a complicated feeling. It was simply the feeling of being exactly where I belonged. If this story reached you today, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment, and if you found something in it worth keeping, pass it on. Take care of yourselves.